Good morning. Welcome to the April 2011 Intellectual Property Breakfast Club. The costs of global intellectual property piracy. How can the phenomenon be empirically quantified? And before I introduce our moderator, I would like you to join me in thanking our sponsors of the Intellectual Property Club, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, and Public Knowledge. And I want to point out, too, on the back of your program, at the bottom are listings of our upcoming intellectual property breakfast events. And there's actually going to be a change in the schedule. The statutory damages for copyright infringement will actually be held in June, on June 14th. And the intellectual property enforcement, where does the law need to be updated, will be held in May. So basically, they're reversed. And so I will now introduce our moderator, Drew Clark. Drew Clark is the chairman and publisher of BroadbandBreakfast.com, a news and events company building a community around broadband stimulus, the National Broadband Plan, and intellectual property. Drew has a long-standing reputation for fairness and depth in his reporting. He worked for the National Journal Group for 8 years, ran the Telecommunications and Media Ownership Project of the Center for Public Integrity, and was assistant director of the Information Economy Project at George Mason University. He has written widely on the politics of telecom, media, and technology for a variety of publications, including the Washington Post, GigaOM, Slate, and Ars Technica. Drew launched Broadband Census in January 2008 as a means of providing objective information about broadband speeds, prices, availability, reliability, and competition. Please join me in welcoming Drew Clark.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate the great turnout for today's event. And Morgan Reed has arrived just in time to be on the panel here. We're excited to have this discussion about statistics and intellectual property piracy. Statistics are a big subject and an important subject in a lot of industries, including broadband. And so we're really happy to bring a little bit of empirical rigor, we hope, to this discussion. We have a very good panel here today, and I will just read their names off left to right. You have your program in front of you, so you can learn a little bit more about them from there. Lauren Yeager is the Director of International Affairs and Trade at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Bruce Lehman is the President of the International Intellectual Property Institute. Stephen Sivek is the Principal for Economists, Inc. Sean Flynn is the Associate Director for the Program on Information Justice and Intellectual Property at Washington College of Law at American University. We've actually had another American University law professor at our Intellectual Property Breakfast Club, so we appreciate your institution support. And Matt Robinson, who's the Senior Vice President and Business Development and General Counsel for Attributor.com. And finally, Morgan Reed, who is the Executive Director of the Association for Competitive Technology. And ACT has been very involved in these issues over the years, as of course has Bruce Lehman and many of you whom I haven't had the chance to meet yet. I'd like to start off by asking Lauren Yeager, who's the author of a 2010 report of the Government Accountability Office on this subject exactly, to give us a brief history of intellectual property piracy statistics and to weigh in on the question of how the methods compute.
Okay, be happy to do that. It's certainly nice to be in a group, and especially with an introduction like that. It's very rare, at least for us. We work for the Congress. Nobody gives the introduction that says, I'm excited to have this discussion about statistics. That's not something that typically leads off a hearing or some of the other opportunities that we have. But we certainly do a lot of work. We think, obviously, as the Government Accountability Office, we do a lot of work trying to bring statistics to the Congress to make sure that at least there's a starting point of discussion, and obviously the policy debate takes on from there. Just in terms of this particular area, this area of intellectual property statistics and counterfeits is in fact at the intersection of a couple of different bodies of work that we've done at GAO in recent years. One is we've done significant work on intellectual property protection, particularly the U.S. government organization to do that. And second, illegal trade, which we call inside trade in bads as compared to trade in goods. We've done a lot of different products having to do with trade in illegal goods, whether it's counterfeit goods, whether it's illegally traded cigarettes, conflict diamonds, Congo minerals, and a whole range of other products. So it's something that we're quite familiar with. But when it comes to looking at this particular one, as Drew said, one of the things that we did first in the report was try to look at the contribution of technology and intellectual property to the economy. Went back to some of the economics readings on that, some of the more important contributors to that. We have some of that material in the background, and obviously it's difficult to put a specific number on the contribution of technology to economic growth, but I think that everyone who's looked at it has recognized just how important that is to the remarkable economic growth that we've witnessed, not just in our lifetime, but in the previous 100 and 150 years. We also did a little bit of work early on in classifying some of the positive and negative effects of fakes, of counterfeit goods. Just try to lay out a framework. It's typically the economic framework. It's certainly not something that we devised, but it's something that was developed and in the economic framework and then utilized by the OECD and others when they do work on this subject. We obviously also talked about the incentives that creates, both the good incentives as well as the bad incentives for consumers, for producers, for illegal traders, et cetera. One of the other things that we did later on was we did take a look at a couple of the studies that were cited fairly frequently in this debate. In particular, as the Government Accountability Office, we looked at the government studies that had often been brought into this discussion. And what we found there was not, I don't think, entirely unusual in the Washington kind of environment, which is that some of the studies that had been commonly cited never existed at all. And these were, one of those was attributed to the FBI, one of those was attributed to Customs and Border Protection, now part of Homeland Security, and a third one was the FTC. So when we went to those agencies to try to find the supporting material for those particular estimates, there wasn't any. And so that's one of the things that we did point out in the report, that at least in those cases, there really wasn't anything to back up the materials.
It was produced by an employee who doesn't work here any longer.
Well, it could be. Actually, they found no records of it. So I think in those cases, they were just, I think this happens, I think, fairly frequently, but we did go back to try to trace those down. And I think in response, the agencies, I think, have at least internally sent out some memos saying these were not studies that should be cited because we don't have the material to support that. That doesn't mean that those numbers will disappear from the public domain. I think that's kind of unlikely, but at least when we tracked it down, there wasn't anything behind it. A couple of the other things that we did, we looked at a couple of the key assumptions that are necessary in order to try to do this. The Congress gave us a mandate to try to provide an economy-wide estimate of the cost of counterfeiting to the U.S. economy. And I think anybody that's done work in this area recognizes just how difficult that task is. And a couple of the things that come up as really difficult hurdles to try to get over, one of those is to try to estimate the substitution rate. And the substitution rate is that if someone is buying a counterfeit purse or a counterfeit DVD or a counterfeit pharmaceutical, in order to try to estimate the costs of that to the economy, you have to think a little bit about what that person would be buying if they didn't buy the fake. Well, that could differ enormously even within one market, much less across markets, across products. And so that substitution rate is sometimes assumed to be one for one, that every product that's purchased illegally would have meant a product that would be purchased in the legal market. There may be some situations where that kind of a substitution rate holds, but it's not likely to be those situations where someone is knowingly purchasing a fake for a fraction of the price of the original. A second very difficult kind of a problem to overcome is to try to figure out, well, how do you value those goods? So for example, the cost of production of a fake DVD in China could be a couple pennies. The sale of that good could cost $1. Obviously, the street price of that good, the legal good itself, is somewhere between $10 and $20. And so, when you're trying to estimate the impact there, which of those particular costs are you going to use? And you can see that depending on what you choose, the estimate of the impact will be enormously different. It won't be just off by 1 order of magnitude, but possibly 2 orders of magnitude. So the kinds of decisions that people make when they do the studies will obviously have a large impact on the ultimate estimate that comes out. We also looked at some of the private sector studies, and some of those have done very good work in terms of learning about the dynamics of particular markets, particular products at a point in time. But one of the challenges that you run into here is that those markets may not be stable, and certainly it's difficult to know whether they're generalizable. So if you're looking at a product, for example, in the recording industry, to what extent are those kinds of insights that you learn relevant 10 years later, given technological change, or in another market? So those are a couple of the difficulties.
Let me just ask, why is it a problem to add up, or would it be a problem to add up losses from recording industry, losses from software industry, losses from movie industry, losses from physically counterfeit goods? What's the problem in adding those all up, sort of figuring out what segments there are?
Well, one problem, of course, is that not all industries have been able to gather the resources necessary to do studies about the level of counterfeiting in those industries. So you're going to have some major holes. Other industries, for good reason, are not anxious to have the information in the public domain about the fact that some of their products are being counterfeited, because it could ruin their reputation and the confidence that consumers might have. For example, maybe in the pharmaceutical industry, there's probably good reason not to put that information out there. And I think the other problem is that even from one market to the next, it's not clear that the dynamics of one market in one city or one location are going to be identical to another. So I guess our point is that it's extremely difficult to come up with ways to generalize from what can be very good studies of particular markets to an overall industry level and certainly to the economy level, and have that be stable over time.
You didn't try to put a dollar value, did you?
Well, when we started, that was the instructions from the Congress, but we felt that it was not something that we could do. And I think actually when people have looked at the OECD study, they had a lot more resources than we have, and they, I think, started out with the same goal and weren't able to come up with that. So that was our bottom line.
But did you get a sense of more in the digital realm or more in the physically counterfeit realm, or did you not break it down?
I'll let some of the other
Sure.
panelists talk to that, because I think, again, our goal there was to give some more general insights about how to think about these studies and how to think about the problems that are associated with trying to get a good number.
I wanted to ask Bruce Lehman, the International Intellectual Property Association, you've been quite involved in providing measurements in conjunction with the Special 301 reports, or just historically you've been involved in this. Could you just speak a little bit about IIPI and the work that you've done in this regard?
Well, I think you got me confused with the IIPA, and Mr. Civic is going to speak to that because he does their analyses, which probably are the leading industry analyses that form the basis for the Special 301 report and are usually cited all over the world. IIPI is an organization that I set up. It's confusingly similar. It's a trademark issue. IIPI is an organization that I set up after I left government 2 years before the end of the Clinton administration, and basically the purpose of it was to work with developing countries to help them learn how to more effectively use intellectual property rights for their own economic growth and development. And so for the last 12 years now, we've been doing that, not on a very large scale, but we have been doing it largely with support from the U.S. government through the USPTO. Now, as a result of that, I've spent, and our staff and our consultants have spent a lot of time in developing countries where piracy and counterfeiting dominate the market for the sale of intellectual property-based products. In addition to that, we also have done studies at the request of the USPTO, and in fact, we have 2 that we're doing right now that relate to this topic. One is a study on camcording in the Asia-Pacific region and its impact on internet distribution of copyrighted works, and also then, you know, physical CDs and so on, that kind of distribution. And in organizing this study, we really had to confront exactly the problems that we've just been talking about here with Mr. Yeager. It's very difficult to figure out. I mean, as he pointed out, one of the biggest problems in dealing with these developing country markets, and I think you have to completely distinguish between developing country markets and developed country markets, is what he referred to as the substitution rate. Because you have widespread, in many of these markets, you have virtually universal the domination by unauthorized or infringing product, but that doesn't necessarily translate into a one-for-one sale, you know, of the original product. So in doing this camcording study, and I have to say I was sort of skeptical about it at first, but I realize now, having visited the region recently, that camcording is, you know, a very serious problem. I can't imagine wanting to look at something that's camcorded, but I guess, you know, the quality isn't that bad for some of these people. But so the way we're going to handle that is that we're going to look, and we've engaged we're actually in the process of engaging some academics to help us design this study. And what we're going to look at is, in this case, we have the advantage of focusing on a particular industry, the motion picture industry. And we are going to look at, and there is a window, maybe not much of a window, but there is a window. Obviously, historically, windows have been a big part of theatrical and other distributions of motion pictures. But there is a window, obviously, between the theatrical release of a motion picture and when the camcording and people can get into the theater and camcord and start to distribute that product. And so we're going to try to basically look at the very, you know, the initial phase of distribution, that first window, first days or week or so, and look at the theatrical revenues during that period, and then see what happens after the camcording starts coming onto the market, so that we can at least use that to get some kind of an idea about the economic impact. One of the interesting things about this particular project is that and this obviously makes this whole subject vastly more difficult than when, you know, I first certainly started working on it many years ago, is the internet, the influence of internet file sharing of products. Obviously, it is a matter that some people consider to be, you know, legally questionable as to whether or not file sharing per se is an infringement even. That's a very hot topic. Clearly, however, the file sharing of a product, of a work that initially was pirated, like a camcording, that clearly is an infringement. Each and every internet distribution would be an infringement. And so our study is also going to try to look at the impact, increasing impact, because in a lot of these markets now you have you know, widespread use of the internet. So we're going to try to look at that. The other study that we have that we're doing is a study where we're looking at the impact of U.S. exports of copyright, of intellectual property-based products in countries which have signed TRIPS Plus agreements. And again, we can look at actual, you know, facts and figures and statistics there, because we can compare what the exports of these industries were, U.S. industries, companies, in a market pre signing a trade agreement, a bilateral trade agreement that contained TRIPS plus provisions, and after. And so that's another study that we're going to be able to do. And then finally, I just want to say one thing, and before I, yield my time, and that is that one of the things that's very frustrating about anybody who works in this field is that I think we all know that piracy and counterfeiting exist, and they exist on a very vast scale. It's very difficult to quantify. I think we also know that they have an incredibly negative, maybe not everyone agrees with that, but I think the consensus is that they has a negative impact on the balance of trade, on the exports of a post-industrial country like the United States. And this is a very serious problem when we're dealing with a country like China, where we have a catastrophic trade imbalance. And clearly, and China is a country with widespread internet use and very sophisticated internet use. And this is a country that can shut down the least offensive political material off the internet, and at the same time seems to be completely paralyzed in addressing and regularizing the market for IP-based products. And this is a very, very serious economic problem in our bilateral relationship, and you could expand that to some other countries, but this is the most important one. And it's very important and very timely right now in the economy in general, because the U.S. is hurting. It's having lots of problems. You can't open up the newspaper, and clearly this sense of imbalance with these emerging markets like China is becoming a major source of anxiety to the American people that's creating a political crisis in this country.
Well, thank you very much. Now, Stephen Sivek, I've already introduced you, so to speak. Could you speak about the IIPA studies that you have been involved in and how they have helped begin the discussion about quantifying intellectual property piracy?
Sure. I also have to say that there's a third IP group that I will mention. There's a group called IPI, the Institute for Policy Innovation, who sponsored some of the studies I've done in the past. So it does get very confusing. I got involved in this area in the late 80s. I was involved in research trying to understand why U.S. motion pictures and television programs seem to dominate the world and have seemed to do that for the last 60 or 70 years. Co-author Stephen Wildman and I put together a book with an appendix, an economic model, trying to understand why it was that we had done so well in this area. That effort then led to the beginning of the copyright industry, studies of the copyright industries in an aggregate basis. An umbrella group, the IIPA, International Intellectual Property Alliance, was formed, whose members included the Motion Picture Association, the RIAA, the Business Software Alliance, the music publishers, all got together recognizing they all shared the same problem, and that was intellectual property infringement, intellectual property theft. All of these industries are very high-performing industries in an economic sense. They all do very well against foreign competitors. They all do very well in foreign markets. They create not only jobs, but they create high-paying jobs. Some of my studies have shown that the wages and supplements paid to workers in the copyright industries is 30 to 40% above the U.S. average wages and supplements. And so there's ample reason to want to protect these industries. They are the good guys in terms of America's economic performance. And from the beginning, it was clear that the biggest problem that they faced really was piracy. But before I get there, the IIPA studies began to take off not only here in the U.S., but around the world. It turned out that under the auspices of WIPO, there became studies of the economic importance of the copyright industries in Hungary, or the economic importance of the copyright industries in Russia. There have now been something on the order of 30 or 35 such studies of foreign countries done, and WIPO is beginning to compare some of these areas. But from a policy-making point of view, what was clear is that the copyright industries were an increasing, still small, but an increasing portion of the economies, not only of the U.S., but other countries, and that they were growing very rapidly, particularly in real terms over time. So these studies then ultimately led into subsequent studies of piracy, which I can briefly talk to at this point.
Well, let me ask if we could focus on this issue of aggregating from one industry to another. Did IIPA always approach it as an aggregate, or did you build on a particular microsegment first as you studied this and tried to quantify the actual damages?
Okay, well, the quantification proceeded on an industry-by-industry basis. But one of the goals of the IIPA was to present a unified front so that some of the underlying numbers ultimately were aggregated together. So when you would look at the final report, you would look at the copyright industries. Underlying that were spreadsheets on the motion picture industry and the Business Software Alliance and all these other industries. But again, the focus was let us show a unified front.
So is the issue in totaling these up one of pure substitution of one good for another? What's your take on how you can quantify the loss? Do you say this is the cost of the product in that a movie would sell for in the U.S., and this is what it's being pirated for?
No.
Could you give us an idea of how you
Well, let me give you, I guess, a standard view of how these studies have run over the last 10 or 15 years. There have been a lot of studies, not just done by me, but done by researchers around the world. And I hate to kind of oversimplify, but the basic notion is, first of all, we have a measure of how many infringing or pirated goods there are in a given market. And we get that from surveys, or maybe we're going to get that from looking at peer-to-peer quantities in these days. But you have some measure of that. And then you also have an idea of prices, and we're talking here about the legitimate prices. And that can be complicated because, for example, the movie industry has release windows, so we have a legitimate price for theatrical exhibition, we have a legitimate price for DVD sales, DVD rentals, and then we have the substitution rate. Now, how that gets arrived at is generally been in surveys. It turns out that if you ask someone, were it not for piracy, how many pirated movies, how many legitimate movies would you go see, people will actually give you answers. This was at first surprising, but it turns out that it does happen in numerous surveys around the world. So based on that sort of information, you now can begin thinking about this hypothetical, because any economic analysis of this type has to have a hypothetical question, which is, were it not for piracy, what is the sales we would make? And that embodies the business loss. So that hypothetical state of the world is what comes out of the substitution rate, which in turn is driven by surveys.
No, thank you for going through that. Now I want to turn to Sean Flynn and ask for your response to this approach. How does this calculation of loss, is it a sound approach? Do you have criticisms or thoughts about the way that IAPA and others have approached this question?
Yes, I have thoughts. I think a lot of what, well, first, the report that we put out, the Media Piracy and Emerging Economies report, tried to look at some of these issues. I think it was very helpful for Stephen to lay out the various steps, right? So there's not a lot of debate about what the legitimate prices are in developing countries. Now I'm speaking from the perspective of emerging economies, as Bruce was, and I completely agree with Bruce's comment, and I think it's the core of to the extent there's a dispute, or at least a real open question in developing country research, it's the one that Bruce identified, which is it's extremely hard to figure out the substitution rate question in developing countries. And where it's been done, or where we think it might have been done, that information has not been publicly released. So we don't we don't know, and I would love to ask Stephen here what we know about substitution rates in developing countries. The MPE report attempts to kind of reframe this research a little bit. So the first line of the report is that much of what we know about piracy in the public discourse starts and often ends with industry-sponsored research. And much of that industry-sponsored research, often for legitimate proprietary concerns, is not public. The data that's used to derive at the loss figures and the piracy figures, et cetera, cannot be analyzed. So we don't know how the loss figures are ultimately calculated. Stephen was completely correct that in his studies, I think a lot of his studies are very complex and extremely interesting. And he doesn't use one-to-one translation figures, as was the case in many industries even until last year. I mean, the Business Software Alliance was claiming losses based on every observed impact of every observed incidence of piracy of software cost the full legitimate price as a one-to-one relationship, and that was inputted into the 301 process until the 2010 301 process. So that Stephen does not make that mistake, and I think his research is great in kind of pushing the industry to admit its blatant failures. But then when you move into trying to estimate piracy losses in developing countries, the problem that the MPE report really focuses on is that piracy in developing countries appears to be, the primary cause of it appears to be exclusionary pricing practices. So when you go to India with a GDP per capita of $1,500 US or something like that, you walk into a CD store and the CDs are charging the same price as they are in the US. You want to buy a Coldplay CD, it's going to be between 11, 15, sometimes 20 bucks. Same in South Africa, $20 music CDs in a country with an average GDP per capita of $3,500, but a median of much lower than that because of wealth inequality. So what the report basically, one of its major findings is that the companies, because of global uniform pricing, in poor countries are really pricing to the very elite sliver of the market that can afford basically US incomes. You're pricing out 80, 90, 95% of the market in many countries. And this is happening at the same time that doing piracy is incredibly easy and cheap. It's very easy, whether it's for personal use or whether it's for commercial use, it's very cheap and easy to make a new copy on a CD, to download something on the internet, et cetera. So you have pirate market prices are falling dramatically. You can, prices over the last 10 years, it's not a very lucrative business anymore. It's really marginal cost pricing. You can pick up, movie DVDs for 50 cents in pirate markets in most developing countries. And yet the licit price for that same good is going to be multiple times that. So there's no competition between the licit goods and the pirate goods. Now, what that does to the modeling is that the substitution rates that are going to happen in developing countries are just going to be radically different than they are in developed countries. And I don't know of any of these surveys that have been done in developing country markets to figure out what the substitution rates are. We know of some in the US, et cetera.
What are some of them in the US?
Well, some of them, these is Stephen's work. As I recall, I think some of the models for substitution of online music piracy is 20%?
10% is
10%.
I had assumed that.
So that's in
10% meaning of 10 people who pirated it, one would buy it at the legitimate price.
And this was in a 2005 study, so if I were to redo that now, given the change in quantities, that almost certainly would change.
Would it be lower or higher?
Lower.
Now,
Yeah,
so
take that number and now extrapolate what you think it is when the same good is priced at the same price in a country with 1/10 of the GDP per capita. It's going to be lower. It's going to be minuscule. The markets in these countries are minuscule because of pricing. There's only, your effective market in India is probably about 8% of the entire people that live in India. And whatever piracy rate that's actually displacing losses is basically going to be the piracy that goes on in that income segment. People who earn $800 a year and pirate a music CD are not displacing anything. If they don't have that pirate copy, they're just not going to have access to the music. They're not going to go to the CD store and suddenly shell out 20 bucks. So I think the big picture from the report is that there's a gap in business models. and that piracy is a problem and a symptom and needs to be addressed. But the way to address it is not to necessarily, in those countries, ramp up draconian enforcement. It's to come up with legitimate, licit business models that actually serve all segments of the community. And that's where the real gap is. We're not seeing that emerging from the content industry. And so the pirate industry is basically taking its place. It's serving the part of the market that's not being served now.
We'll join this discussion in a moment with some of the others who've spoken, but I want to jump to Morgan for a quick moment and ask, is the point that has just been made by Sean about the movie and music industry not changing their prices, not lowering them in the international markets? If true, is that true of the software markets? And how do you, in the software industry, measure using, for example, the replacement, was it the ARL figure?
Right.
Could you discuss that, please?
Well, I'll back up one step and just begin at the beginning, which is there's a reason we do these studies. And the reason we do these studies for three basic reasons. One, we want to decide on proper allocation of resources. How much money should the government spend? How much should the private sector spend on combating piracy? We do it also, the next reason we do it is to find out the efficacy of the government and private industry work. And the third is, and this is really the most significant, is to define the size of the market opportunity that exists if we're able to eliminate some of the piracy that we're facing. I thought it was interesting that Sean brought up the number that, gee, only 8% of India has enough money to buy like Americans. Anyone know how much the 8% of India is? It's 120 million people. Right now, there are more than 200 million people in China that can purchase like Americans. Now, we know median income is lower. We know that in the western part of China, where I've spent my time, there's definitely lower income. But 200 million people in China can purchase like Americans. So to Sean's point that, gee, we're just not pricing it right, if that were true, then Adobe would see many multiples larger number of sales in China because the market's roughly the same size as America. Now, we're discounting Sean's point about the 1.2 billion people that they have that can't afford to live like Americans. But looking at the 200 million that can, those folks aren't buying either. So if we take the number we heard, 10%, 1 in 10, he gave us 8%. Okay, let's take an 8% replacement rate and let's still see how much money we're losing. 8% of India should be able to purchase just like Americans, should be willing to accept that rate change. So to your question about replacement rate, I think we need to remember that we are looking at this as a market opportunity. Where do we grow? How do we find technological solutions to some of these problems? Because the market is there. And I think it does a disservice to the developing world when you suggest, oh, they're too poor, they're too savage, they aren't capable of understanding how to do this. Having worked in the developing world, I think process really matters. And what we want to do is look at it from a take versus give. So I think on the replacement rate question, I'm okay with doing it with one that matches the size of the economy that's available to purchase. And I think we should not worry about the difficulty in defining the number.
Could you also briefly address the average software load question, how you measure that via online reporting back type of mechanisms?
Well, one of the problems that we saw, and we had a small business in upstate New York that did some internal surveys on the load question. Small company, Ambrosia Software, 12 employees in upstate New York. And they saw that more than 50% of the requests for updates were coming from unique, separate IP addresses, and all of them using fake codes. They made some changes to their model, and now they've moved some software into China, and they're seeing 75%. So the question of how much to look at it from a load perspective.
Could you just explain that a bit for our audience? What does that mean to measure the load? How many times someone downloads it?
It depends on how we look at it. If we're looking at it from how many times someone downloads it, well, we have to break it into unique identifiers. I mean, either by individual IP address or in the case of mobile devices, a UDID, versus the number of times that it's requested that may be one person requesting it more than one time. So what we're looking at especially in the developing world, the load question, I think, can be discounted. In other words, you have to assume that there's a fair number of people downloading more than once. But I think the numbers that we see when we base it on unique identifiers show that it's still very high.
Thank you. Matt, could you speak about what tools Attributor uses and what Attributor is doing in the book publishing industry and others perhaps to physically measure lost sales?
Sure, and maybe I should start by just a couple second background on the company. I'm the president at Attributor, and we're a small technical company held privately in San Mateo, California, about 80 employees. We're using essentially a massive crawling infrastructure and digital fingerprinting and comparison algorithms to track all different types of content web-wide. So that's web pages, cyber lockers, P2P torrent indexing sites, that sort of thing. And so our client base ranges from newspapers, newswires, magazines, book publishers, motion picture studios with their scripts, financial institutions with their analyst reports. It really does run the gamut. For purposes of this conversation, I'll focus in on book publishing, primarily because we represent about 50 of the largest book publishers, so that's probably the only area that I think we should be talking about statistics in a significant way. But the short story of what we're seeing right now is obviously piracy is on the rise. Some of the studies that we've done, and these are on our website, but last year we looked at 1,000 books and we verified 9 million infringements within a 2-week period for those 1,000 books. One issue that we're talking about, the market substitution effect here, is when we look at this on the digital side, and this is why cyber lockers have really come to replace P2P and torrent sites as the biggest threat, or at least for book publishers, is it's a one-to-many relationship. An illegal copy of a book is uploaded to RapidShare or Wattpad or 4Share to one of these other sites, and it's downloaded X number of times within 3 clicks off of my iPad. The impact here is, and this data, the number of actual downloads is not available. It used to be available. 18 months ago, most of these sites actually published that number on every single page where there was a download. We like to think that they removed it because we started sending them tens of thousands of notices a day, and damages looked like a little rolling clock with damages rolling up. I don't know why, but all of them stripped that number out. We saw at the time, anywhere ranging from 100 downloads per file. We saw many files with over 1 million downloads per file. So when you look at 1,000 books, 9,000 illegal copies of that book each, how many downloads were occurring, then you actually ask the substitution effect. This is a tough question to answer in terms of measuring what the digital damage is from a piracy perspective. That said, what we try and do, and the services that we provide are insight around how books and other content is being used across the web, and then we provide actual services to have those copies of that content removed by quick identification. I don't want to pitch products, but we just, and I won't, I'm the only private enterprise guy, right? So we just did actually launch a tool called the Fair Notice Feed, which we think will help bridge that gap between rights holders and content hosting sites, because where we see the friction, at least what we hear from publishing customers, is the time of identification is actually fairly quick. That's Attributor's job. The time from identification and notification to removal can be a couple of hours in the best instance, all the way to several days in the worst instance. And it's during that time period where you see the downloads and damage occurring, and obviously that equates to some sort of lost sales figure. What the Fair Notice Feed is essentially allowing any site to do is take our feed, it's a rolling list of URLs with confirmed infringements, and process that automatically for a removal. The second piece to that, which the first piece actually reduces that latency down to near zero. The second piece of that is within that feed is not just URL remove action, but also URL swap action. We built an API and are working with different book publishers. So rather than RapidShare rendering a page that says this file has been removed, they make an API call and we swap back a page that says, oh, here's James Patterson. We knew you were looking for him. Here's an authorized channel. Here's a discount code. Here's a bunch of different business models that we can now test.
You're trying to turn piracy into sales.
Right.
But what do you measure in the process of doing that? How do you kind of weigh in on what rates there are of piracy or what substitution there is or isn't of
Well, we'll see. It's a little early to tell in terms of what the conversion rates will be. We just started testing that. What we did see in the fall was we essentially went out and bought Google ads for about 90 books, mostly bestsellers. And every single day we saw between 2 and 3 million people searching for free book, some name. So we're talking about literally 3 million people a day looking for a free book. And we showed that data to a couple of our customers, and one book publishing CEO said, well, those are consumers. How do we make them customers? And our response was, well, removals might be the answer in certain circumstances. You may have to remove that market substitute effect to actually drive sales, but there's also a way to, if there's a way to actually capture and harness some of that energy and bring those people into the loop, that's what we now want to test. That's what kind of the fair notice feed's about.
Let me come back to the high-level point that Morgan made, which is why are we trying to measure this? And he identified at least one issue being how resources are spent. And I want to go back to Lauren for a second here and ask you, what is the most reliable method of the various forms of measurement? And being cognizant of the fact that most of them are industry supported, how does the Government Accountability Office, Office say, well, is there a way to aggregate these together? You basically concluded no, didn't you? Do you think that there's still some value in what the various industries are doing?
Well, certainly there's some good studies out there, Steve, and some others have really gotten some great insights about the willingness to pay, for example, of consumers for goods and comparison of a fake versus a real good. I think it also does help, in some cases, direct law enforcement resources to areas where they can be most effective. And so, for example, I think there are limited resources, as everyone knows, within law enforcement, other government agencies to try to direct their activities at those that bring the most benefit to the United States, whether it's protecting the safety or the health of consumers or others. And I think that some of the studies help to inform the decisions that are made at the agencies in order to allocate those kinds of resources. The government has made some attempts. I mean, there are government statistics that at least can bring some insights to bear on this. For example, seizure statistics at the U.S. border can give you some insight as to the nature of the goods that are coming in, because seizures, for example, will give at least some clues about the fact that most of the goods that come in are either shoes or handbags or some other types of goods that are seized at the border. But I think one of the things we've looked very closely at, the process that Customs and Border Protection has at the U.S. border, and I think it's quite clear that they're not catching everything that comes in at the border. The volume of trade that goes through some of the ports like Los Angeles, Long Beach, and some of the other big ports is absolutely overwhelming, and there's an enormous amount of pressure for Customs and Border Protection to move the goods through the port. And sometimes opening these containers and opening the boxes, you find these things, and you look at a box, you get inside there, and you say, unless you're an expert, you really don't know whether it's a fake or not. And so that means you're holding that aside in a bonded warehouse. You're trying to call the content owner or other, try to find out, whether these goods are in fact legitimate goods being traded. And frankly, in many cases, it's quite difficult. And that means it takes time, and that means goods are building up in those bonded warehouses, and people are calling up and saying, where are those goods? We want those goods to move through the port. So there are some insights that you can get even from the government statistics, but again, they give you some clues, they give you some insights, but it's quite difficult to go from that to a broader estimate. But without a question, I think that having some of these things does allow both the firms to direct their own activities, who make a big investment in trying to cut off the counterfeits, as well as the limited resources of the federal agencies that do divert some part of their resources, but particularly in a situation where Customs was brought into the Department of Homeland Security for the purpose of trying to protect the United States against weapons of mass destruction. You can imagine that the attention that was given to these kinds of issues of blocking counterfeits from coming into the United States dropped off. Now, I think they've tried to achieve that balance again, but at least for a few years, there really wasn't that much attention on these, because the primary goal of Department of Homeland Security and the whole reason it was created was to try to protect the United States from weapons of mass destruction coming in. So you can understand from the law enforcement and the U.S. government perspective that trying to achieve that balance and determine where to allocate those resources is a very important kind of a goal.
Now, when there was a hearing on a background IP matter earlier this month, Senator Leahy cited a figure of $100 billion in losses from piracy, and we went and looked and asked Senator Leahy where this number came from, and he said, well, it's on page 2, footnote 4, referring to one of Steven Civek's reports, the $100 billion. So these numbers are being cited. They are causing policymakers to take notice. And is it correct that these numbers are used? Stephen and Sean, is it legitimate that Congress is saying, well, this is indeed the loss that the U.S. is experiencing from piracy?
Well, I think it's certainly legitimate for Congress to think about order of magnitude how large the loss is. I think this discussion makes clear that people can differ in a variety of assumptions and a variety of underlying data sources. But I think to the extent that one has to motivate looking at policy, one has to motivate possible policy changes that we should be advocating, particularly in non-U.S. markets. Do we want our trading partners to change their copyright laws? Do we want them to introduce statutory damages? I'm not saying one way or the other, but this is why you need to have these sorts of studies, order of magnitude. And I sometimes think that then fighting about the last 2% of the value is counterproductive, because the broader point is clear. No one denies that piracy is a big problem.
And when GAO says they can't be boiled down to a number, is that fair, or would you differ? What's Lauren getting wrong here when he says it's hard to boil it down to a single number the way your studies have?
Well, I think what's wrong with that is I think GAO in their report also said, we believe that it's a big problem. And so you have sort of a disconnect. Everybody has this gut feeling that this is a big problem, and we're going to worry about quantifying it to the last penny. That's a disconnect. It either is a big problem or not, and I guess that's my concern with the GAO report.
We certainly want to get the audience's questions, so please think about this. But Sean, what do you say to what Lauren's saying and what Steve are saying, that we have to at least get started on quantifying, as Steve is saying?
I mean, a couple of things. There's a recent trend in research in this area which is extremely positive, and that's a shift towards independent research from industry research. So, can Leahy take that $100 million or $100 billion, what was it, $100 billion figure and wave it around as the truth? No, he can't. It may be the truth, it may not, but we can't really tell because all the underlying kind of assumptions that were used to figure that number based on proprietary data is not released. So we don't know if that number is real. There's a lot of assumptions within it that we can see that don't appear to be valid or testable, and I think that's what the GAO study essentially says. I think it's true that everyone agrees that there is a ton of piracy in the world. I don't think everybody agrees about the extent to which that's a problem, or where it's a problem, or where enforcement resources should be dedicated to fix it. The enforcement question is just a nesting of the original policy question. So every expenditure of an enforcement dollar is taking away from an enforcement dollar somewhere else. And so ultimately all law enforcement agencies, whether they're enforcing intellectual property or trying to ferret out weapons of mass destructions or cutting off murders, are trying to decide where to focus resources to have the best bang for the buck. And the bang for the buck question is the loss question. So you can't just say, 90% of the market in India for music is pirated music, and therefore we need to expend way more resources in India. Whether that enforcement decision is reasonable depends on the losses in India. It may be that it's much more bang for the buck to focus on the 8% of piracy in the US market than the 90% in India market, because the 8% in the US may or may not have greater substitution effects. Although what we don't know, I mean, there's a bunch of questions that we would like to break out to figure that out. So in whatever market you're studying piracy, is the piracy existing primarily in this segment that's priced out? There's a priced out segment in the US, there's a priced out segment in India. If most or all of the piracy is in the priced out segment, then the enforcement resources dedicated to it are not going to be as reasonably spent. So those are the questions that I think, Lauren is right, that the research that we have now doesn't really bring conclusions to and is not sufficiently transparent to test. But we may be shifting into a world of more public research on this area where you can look at the underlying data.
So John Pehoff from Carnegie Mellon University, where we are doing this work. you've rightfully differentiated between different areas that have perhaps different substitution rates, but also law enforcement or any of the other kind of interventions you might think about has got to think about what is enforceable and what is not. And that also varies from country to country and even portions of the U.S. versus portions of the U.S. Have these estimations been broken up in that way, in ways that that you would like to, you're able to comment on in terms of?
Are you talking to, you should talk to Stephen, I think.
The magnitude of the problem versus how it differs based on the ease of enforcement.
You want to address that, Steve?
That's really not something I've studied on the enforcement side.
Well, let's ask Bruce if he has any thoughts on this. What about this point that Sean made earlier regarding going after piracy in the developing versus the developed worlds?
Well, I think that relates to the question that was just asked. And, I think there have been legitimate criticisms from time to time of the work that Mr. Civic has done, and IIPA largely because it's industry sponsored. But I have to give them a lot of credit. They're the only people really who've been doing it. And so that's why, at least up until now, Senator Leahy and others have no other information to go on. And anyone who's been around the world certainly knows, at least anecdotally, that there's some substance to this. Now, whether or not you get into these questions about, how you organize markets, what the market will bear, that's sort of a separate question, but clearly there are big losses to U.S. industry in this regard. However, your question was really the difference between the developed or established markets and these developing country markets. And I think, there's just an absolutely crystal clear difference between the two markets. Yes, you have illegal product distributed you have fake CDs and counterfeit watches being distributed in Chinatown. You have, in New York, you have people, who are bringing goods in illicitly in container ships in California and so on and so forth. But that is really sort of a manageable crime problem in the United States, just like every other crime problem is. You're never not going to have any crime. It is not an activity that dominates the marketplace here. And any property owner, no matter what the property is, part of their business strategy has to stop their product from being stolen. And people who do that are going to have a fairly, organized and robust market in the United States. The problem overseas, particularly in these developing country markets, is an entirely different matter, however. And it has a number of different components to it. One is just the practical component of what's really going on in those countries. And I think that, for those who want to sort of downplay the significance of piracy, whether it's really not a big issue, have to consider the fact that organized piracy of intellectual property products in much of the developing world is a highly organized business. And it's an illegal business, an illicit business. In fact, Moises Naim wrote a book a number of years ago. There hasn't been anything quite like it since, former director of the World Bank, called Illicit. And he explained how really intellectual property piracy is just one of several illicit businesses that form the basis of an illicit economy in the world that sort of is the underside of globalization, of the illicit economy. And it's sort of the same cartels, the same people that move these illicit products through the marketplace. Now, we were in the Philippines just, maybe I shouldn't have mentioned Philippines. We were in a developing country recently talking to some people there. And, the allegation is made that at a very high level in the Philippine government, there are people that are actually aiding, abetting, organized piracy activity. Now, this not only displaces sales, however you organize business models, however you organize substitution rates, and that's a really interesting subject worthy of a big, program of its own. But however you think of that, that kind of activity is extremely corrupting for these societies. And I think anyone who travels around the world to developing countries knows that probably the biggest problem that we have, it's what causes, you know, Homeland Security to have to spend so much money, is that we have a real breakdown in the rule of law throughout the world. And piracy and counterfeiting are a major part of that. Clearly, people in very highly placed positions in many of these countries are aiding and abetting in that activity, and that's a very serious problem.
Morgan, you want to weigh in? And briefly.
Just quickly, it's interesting that Bruce and everyone is using the word developing as in a verb, as in moving forward. If you look at this question of, well, we should not worry about the developing world because, well, they're the developing as compared to the United States. China right now, 39% of China's income of their GDP is domestic consumption. The United States is 70%. So when we're looking at how we look at piracy as an opportunity to get into markets, this means that there's a huge opportunity to change. And so when we say developing, you have to remember that we don't just set them aside and ignore them. This is where we'll make the future money that the United States makes in innovative technologies. So that's why I think it's important that we don't just sidestep the developing nations. They're our new market.
Hi, Tom Sidner with Innovators Network. Just to be clear, Innovators Network's 501c3 think tank associated with the Association for Competitive Technology. So, hi, Morgan. Question for Mr. Flynn. I've had the opportunity to read your study on media piracy in emerging economies. I found it extraordinarily disappointing is probably a mild word, a mild phrase. What I think bothered me about it in many respects is the just absolutely bone-deep ideological bias, I think, against the general idea of commerce, tinged with a huge dose of very flagrant anti-Americanism. But as far, more specifically, in your report, as in your presentation today, you made a big show of the importance of transparency and how we don't get that except from academics like yourself. And that's interesting because no sooner in your report did you finish singing the praises of transparency than you cited an academic study published in 2007 by Professors Oberholzer, Guy, and Stumpf on file sharing. All the data in that study, sir, is completely secret. Even the agreement that makes it secret is a secret. As a result, the results are completely non-reproducible, and yet you cite it as an example of how wonderful academic research is. I wonder why your commitment to transparency disappears when something says something you like. And number two, second question is, I just want you to respond to this quote from your study. With regard to imported IP goods, legal sales represent an outflow of revenue from the national economy. The piracy of IP imports, conversely, represents a welfare gain in the form of expanded free access to valuable goods. Because of U.S. dominance of global film and software markets, the piracy of these goods in other countries falls overwhelmingly into this category, with revenue loss to U.S. companies, but gained by consumers on the receiving end. Do we really want to go back to the trade policies of the Vikings?
Any reaction?
Sure. So, I mean, let me start with the comment that the entire report is ideological attack on the idea of commerce. I think that's a very odd statement for someone who has read the report. I think the entire report, what it's really focusing on is the statement that I made, which is that there's a business model problem in global commerce. And the business model problem is that our commerce is not reaching all segments of the global economy. So when your colleague says that it's perfectly appropriate to target goods at 8% of the economy and then use draconian enforcement efforts to cut off access to illicit goods to the other 92% of the economy, and then expect this kind of culture of respecting intellectual property to move into its place, I find that to be a very ideologically misguided view of the world. I don't think you can serve just 8% of an economy of over 1 billion people and expect the excluded 92% to comply with the laws that you're...
Let's let him reply here to your question earlier.
So that's part of what we're doing. And there's a lot of the report that's actually focusing on how can new business models emerge that can serve entire economies. And so that's not anti-commerce. It may be anti your view of commerce, but it's not anti-commerce. And the point that you quoted at is actually just kind of basic global economics, right? So there are losses, when there are losses that takes place, it says.
So the rule of law contributes nothing to the economic success of the developed world. Now, the World Bank disagrees with you. It says that's our most important economic asset. And basically, to be good at enforcing copyrights or trademarks or anything else, you have to be relatively good at enforcing all private rights. And so your point is, you look at the situation in the developing world, you say, gosh, piracy is rampant. They've killed off their domestic creative industries. And because piracy is rampant, the developed world creative industries that have not yet been killed off in their domestic markets aren't pricing in a way that would serve these markets that are filled with rampant piracy, but isn't part of the solution to that if these countries clean up their
let's look at it this way. There's a common thesis that America was once a great pirate nation, and that we would take and pirate the goods of Britain and England, and as soon as we started to develop an intellectual property tradition of our own, well, that's when we wanted to start to enforce intellectual property. I'd love Bruce and Sean's reaction to that thesis, that can we expect that a country like China is going to shift from being a, quote, pirate nation to being one that wants to protect its intellectual property as it becomes more economically developed?
I react very strongly to statements like that because, you know, you hear that a lot. You know, the U.S. was a pirate nation, et cetera, et cetera. The short answer to that is no, absolutely no. To the extent that what we're talking about here is infringement under the law. We're talking about intellectual property theft under the law. At the time that the United States engaged in piracy of the works of Dickens, of English authors, and so on and so forth, the United States copyright law did not extend copyright to those authors. Similarly, prior to the WTO treaty and the TRIPS agreement, and many bilateral treaties that we have signed throughout the world, in many countries, intellectual property rights did not extend to works of U.S. authorship or U.S. intellectual property ownership. However, what's happened now is that we have, at least in theory, a global rule of law as a result of you know, a variety of international legal instruments that all interact. We have statutes in each and every member country of the WTO, the WIPO, et cetera, which have adopted these standards, and we see violations of those standards. So there is a big difference between taking something that is not against the law to take and taking something that is against the law to take, and that's where you get a, quote, rule of law problem. From the point of view of the United States, this has huge implications because, and I was a part of these negotiations during the 90s, when, you know, I can remember when you could go to Macy's and buy a shirt made in the United States and lots of other products. You can't anymore. We have agreed basically to completely abandon the market for low-cost physical manufactured goods in the United States in return for our capacity, presumably, to export based on our comparative advantage. Intellectual property rights are absolutely key to that comparative advantage. We made agreements with other states to recognize those rights so that we would have an equitable and balanced international trading relationship, and that has not happened. And one of the things that I think is, you know, sort of like the emperor's no clothes problem is that we're now 17 years into the TRIPS agreement and WTO treaty, and most people aren't really acknowledging that it's a complete failure from my point of view.
Sean, do you agree with what Bruce has said, or?
I completely agree with what Bruce has said. I don't believe that frame appears in our report, and it's not one used. It is about the flexibility within copyright law that changes, through your development levels. I don't think necessarily whatever we did 200 years ago is exactly what the developing countries should do today, although I do think it stands for the principle that there needs to be flexibility within the application of intellectual property laws over different development levels. But let me come back to an interesting point I think made in the report about China. That's a pro-commerce point, and actually a pro-licit market point, which is that the story in China around piracy markets, at least for movie sales, has changed dramatically. So it used to be that the market in China was much like India. You had basically, pirated movies were the main way that people accessed DVDs. And the licit sales were an extremely small percentage of the economy, and we're charging, $30 for the DVD, and it was, $3 for the pirate copy or whatever. And the movies, the DVD sellers were basically, the licit DVD sellers were basically getting none of the economy. And what they did is they had price competition with the pirate market. So in conjunction with enforcement efforts, they lowered the prices of the licit sales dramatically. And it had a dramatic effect on the pirate market for movies within China. And now you can pick up a copyrighted movie CD in China for between $3 and $5, including at the local Walmart and whatever. Massive price discrimination. The pirate market has gone essentially underground, and as is the basic thesis of the report, it is serving the underserved market. But the underserved market in China now is the high-priced market. So the pirate market is now serving much better video quality and better audio quality and et cetera in these kind of underground establishments. So you can get in China a movie with the original kind of film version screenplay from the American DVD and the cooler soundtrack from the Japanese DVD and the better subtitles from the Chinese replication of the subtitles, et cetera. You can get a higher quality good at a higher price in the pirate market, but the mass market is now the licit market. And that's the opposite of what occurs in most developing countries, and it should be what we're looking towards in the future. You don't want to be a pirate nation, but you will be if you don't have business models and legal incentives for business models that serve the majority of the economy in those countries.
We probably have time for one or two more questions, if there are any, on the discussion. Morgan, what is your take on this last point? Should software companies be differentially pricing their goods in developed markets, or are you going to hold the line against that on the grounds that many more are coming up to a Western standard, so to speak?
Well, two things. It's always interesting, we call it competition. Competition is usually between two parties with similar costs of input to production, and we compete on things like innovation or other elements, better marketing. So you aren't really in competition with the pirates. You are dealing with the pirates as an impact on your business. They compete only in the sense that they have nearly zero cost of production. But I think what is more interesting about it is the solutions that, we heard some earlier, that we're seeing in there. Another statistic that's important about China is China Telco, the largest telco in China, has 581 million subscribers. The AT&T T-Mo merger together will only get to about 135, which is actually only about the same size as the second largest carrier in all of China. So for our folks, the smartphone market, which right now is about 6% penetration, getting it up to 25, like it is here in the United States, is a quintupling of our market opportunity. Now, what we've seen on smartphones is that we've done price differential. If you went to Walmart or Best Buy to buy a piece of software, you'd pay $49 for it, $39. The price point on a mobile app is usually between 99 cents and $5. So we've done the price competition to widen the market. And through curated store models like we see on Apple and Windows Phone 7 and RIM, we're actually getting paid. We testified to this. About 70% of all the apps on the iOS are actually paid. So this is a huge opportunity for us, but here's the risk that piracy presents. We've already lowered our costs to start hitting those downstream markets. If piracy gets to the smartphone market, we're in trouble. We don't have any more room to do price competition. We're at 99 cents, and we're depending on volume to make up the difference between the box software at 49 and our iPhone app at 99 cents, because developmentally it takes nearly the same amount of people. So I'd say we have to be aware of that reality on the price competition.
Thank you. Let's give Matt and Steve a chance to say a few last words before we conclude our program.
Well, just on the point of smartphones and devices, one statistic that I think is fairly interesting is we tracked from the moment of the iPad release, we saw a 25% lift in overall increase, and that's been steady for the past year. So what we're looking at here is as newer devices are released, we are seeing an increase in piracy given the ease with which you can actually download a file. We're also seeing, we haven't published any studies on this yet, but we're also seeing app piracy become a very, very large issue. So full catalogs of software, full catalogs of libraries of books being rendered in an application on even iOS as well as Android. So that is a trend that we're seeing, and we're studying that, and hopefully we'll do some research to be produced in another quarter or so.
Steve, last word.
Let me just say that perhaps we've spent a bit too much time on the pirate products that we're most familiar with. China does have some positive things that it's doing in copyright enforcement. In particular, there's a place in China called Nantong, which is about an hour downriver from Shanghai, and it's traditionally a cotton producing and textile producing center. In the 80s, some Taiwanese businessmen moved into Nantong, and they had patterned quilts and patterned pillowcases and that sort of thing. The Chinese stole the patterns, and the Taiwanese sued in Chinese court. And as a result of all of this effort, what happened was a commitment by the Chinese government to have intense copyright enforcement mechanisms placed in Nantong for these sorts of products. There are special courts, copyright courts. They have at these courts rows and rows of files of registered patterns. And if you have someone who has stolen your pattern, you simply just take a sample and go right to the court and do this. And it has helped this part of China grow dramatically, particularly in export sales of these sorts of products. And I just throw that out because it's a complicated area. We focus on movies, and we should, and recorded music and software, but there are other things going on in a place like China, particularly when you're in these different sorts of product areas.
One other data point I might throw out just as it relates to China is none of the top 10 CyberLocker hosting sites are actually located in China currently. And when we were in Beijing meeting with the IP office for China, as well as the top 3 book publishers, they gave us the reason, which is they're not publishing digitally at all yet. And what we're seeing is slowly a rise in Chinese published material showing up on some of these sites, but the sites themselves aren't located in China. We're seeing scans of Chinese materials, but it's an interesting phenomenon. I think we're right at the front line of that market exploding online.
Sylvia, Syracuse will conclude our discussion here today.
So I want to thank Drew Clark, our publisher and chairman, moderator of the event, and our panelists. Join me in thanking them, please. I want to point out again on the back of the program is our upcoming intellectual property breakfast clubs. And as I mentioned earlier, the May and the June events are going to be reversed. So intellectual property enforcement will be held on May 10th, and statutory damages for copyright infringement will be held on June 14th. And I wanted also to point out there are surveys on the table, and if anyone would like to fill them out, please drop them off at the desk. If you need another survey, please contact me. And finally, I want to once again thank our sponsors of the Intellectual Property Breakfast Series, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, NCTA, and Public Knowledge. Please join me in thanking our sponsors.